time to start this morning. Certainly it's good to see everybody here. A couple announcements to make before we get started. I don't have a whole lot. First, let's remember all the sick in our prayers as they're dealing with health issues. Sister Debbie in the nursing home. Brenda, who's recovering from knee surgery. Apparently she's overdoing it a little bit. Her knee was swelling up, but she's got a doctor's appointment coming up here, so hopefully maybe she'll get to come home. So it depends on her, from what I understand. So let's keep her in our prayers. Keep Debbie in our prayers. Keep Kelly in our prayers. He's out of town, so he can help him take care of his mom. As far as activities goes, not a whole lot going on. Remember, 31st is dinner, so keep that on your calendars. Is there anything else? Oh, there's a thank you card on the back from Hunter. We help supporting him in preacher school, so that's back there on the thank you card back there, letter back there, so make sure you take a look at that. Is there anything else? If not, Dennis, would you open us with a word of prayer, and then we'll get started.
Father in heaven, we thank you for today. It's the first day of the week. Thank you for allowing us to come and worship you in spirit and truth. Father, continue to be with the ones that Brandon's mentioned. Be with them, comfort them on as you can. Be with the ones looking after them. Father, as we continue to this study, help us to have an open heart, an open mind, always want to delve into your scriptures to continually learn more about you, so that hopefully we can be the instrument that you want us to be, so that others can see you, so that others can see you through us. Father, forgive us of our wrongs, and we repent and turn from them, Christ, and we pray. Amen.
All right. We're in Hebrews chapter 9. That's where we're at this morning. Hebrews chapter 9, and we're going to pick up where we left off last week. We were ready to start verse 26 last week. We're going to read back up and read 24 and 25 as well before we kind of dive into this, because 24 and 25 is the first part of the sentence. There in the thought behind this, we've been talking about the idea of Christ being specifically in the last several verses this better sacrifice. And this better sacrifice that came with better promises, that came with a better tabernacle or a house of the Lord, and that idea behind this. If you look there at verse 24 of Hebrews chapter 9, for Christ has not entered the holy places made with hands, which are copies of the true, but into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God for us. Not that he should offer himself often, as the high priest enters the most holy place every year with the blood of another. We talked about that last week, about how Christ made this sacrifice once. He entered into the holy place, which is heaven, once, whereas under the old law, the high priest had to make sacrifices how often? Once a year, over and over again, repeated sacrifices. They entered the Holy of Holies how often? Once a year. When you go back, you really delve into it, it comes, they entered it 3 times on the Day of Atonement. But once a year, they had to go in and make sacrifices and repeatedly do this. And that's the idea that the Hebrew writer is bringing out. And Christ made this sacrifice once. And we looked at some other verses dealing with that last week. And we get down to verse number 26. Keeping in mind with what we've already looked at. He then would have had to suffer often since the foundation of the world, but now, once at the end of the ages, he has appeared to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. So the Hebrew writer brings out this idea of, if Christ was a sacrifice under the regulations of the law of Moses, how many times does he have to die on the cross? every year. It's got to happen over and over and over again. He has to go through that suffering of dying on the cross. And the Hebrew writer brings out, he's better than the sacrifices of the old law, because this was a sacrifice that was only made once. And really this carries with it the idea of this phrase right here. But now, once, at the end of the ages, carries with it kind of the idea of once for all. It means one time in a particular place in history, Christ made this sacrifice, and the sacrifice was all-encompassing, capable of being the sacrifice and being able to forgive the sins, going all the way back to creation, but also capable of forgiving sin, going all the way forward until the day of judgment. That's the power of the sacrifice of Christ. And we've talked about this a lot over the last couple of weeks, as the Hebrew writer is talking about this, whereas the sacrifices under the old law, did they have the power to do that? They didn't have the power to do that. They didn't even have the power to forgive sins. They just pushed them back for another year, was the idea. And that's the idea that he's trying to get. Remember, Hebrew writers writing to Jewish Christians who are contemplating, considering going back to the old law. So here, this is another reason as to why Christ is this better high priest. Christ is the better sacrifice. The New Testament in the church is better than the law of Moses. So we get into verse 27, and as it is appointed for men once to die, but after this, the judgment. So now we get Christ came as the sacrifice, and the sacrifice was once. So the Hebrew writer now, he's going to get, here's the reason. Here's the reason Christ came. Here's the reason Christ offered himself as this perfect sacrifice once for all. And it is appointed for men to die once. All men face what? And we're going to face it once. All men face death. We are all going to die. Death is really, it's the idea of it's reserved. It's there, it's waiting for us. It's something that we all are going to deal with and we're all going to face. Now, Paul actually points out a pretty interesting point when you go over and you look at Acts chapter 17, verses 30 and 31. Paul brings out the idea of one of the reasons for why man dies is to be judged. That's one of the reasons why man dies, is to be judged. But also Christ died. One of the reasons that Christ died was that so he could stand as our judge. And that's in Acts chapter 17, verses 30 and 31, and some of those other verses right there. Jesus died once to become the judge. We die because we're going to face judgment. Now, there's other reasons as to why we die, obviously, in the Bible, but that's one of the reasons we see here. And we actually see that in verse 27. As it appointed unto men once to die, then once we die, what happens? Judgment. After this, the judgment. Now, this also implies something else. That it's a very common misconception, very commonly taught in the denominational world. And sadly, there are even some in the Lord's church who believe this. But, well, death is not the end of the line. That after you die, well, there's a chance that you could still change. Is that what this says? Is that what the Bible teaches? There's no.
Not when you put the word after.
Not when you put after. Not when you put that little word after in there. But after this being death, so after you die, the judgment. There's no changing your fate. There's no second chance. If you mess up living your life on earth and you die, there's no changing it. Your fate is sealed. That's the idea behind this. But now there are a lot of denominations in the world. They teach other things. Have you ever heard of baptism for the dead? There's a lot of denominations that believe in baptism for the dead. There's a lot of denominations. Have you ever heard of something called the sale of indulgences? It was big in the Catholic Church. Not as popular now as they used to be, but sale of indulgences. You could go and you could pay a certain amount of money and buy what was called an indulgence, and it would rescue your loved one, whoever it was, from purgatory. That was the idea behind indulgences, and it was money. And you paid it to the Catholic Church. They were the big ones that practiced that. But there are many denominations that teach this, and sadly, there are some in the Lord's church who believe this. There are some in the Lord's church who teach and believe that, well, yes, there's judgment, but it's only going to be, if you're condemned to hell, it's only temporary. It's only going to last. It's going to be like a trial in a courtroom, and you're sentencing. You're sentenced to, well, this is how bad your life was. You're sentenced to 5 years in hell. You're sentenced to 10 years in hell. And then, sadly, there are some in the Lord's church who believe that. That's not what the Bible teaches. It's pointed at a man who wants to die, but after this, the judgment, there are no second chances, and it goes back to what we looked at in the last couple of verses, but also what we're about to see in verse 28. So, as it appointed unto men once to die, but after this the judgment. So Christ was offered how many times? Once. Christ was offered once to bear the sins of many. To those who eagerly wait for him, he will appear for a second time apart from sin for salvation. So we look at verse 28 and some of the verses preceding verse 27. Christ, let me ask this. Is Christ going to die a second time to give mankind a second chance? No. Christ died one time. And that's the idea that's being brought out here. His sacrifice was offered once. Now this also bears into the idea, here's how perfect the sacrifice of Christ was. Because his sacrifice died once. And I think it's interesting. It's an interesting parallel to make here. Because in verse 27, it is appointed for men to die how many times? Once. How many times did Christ die? Once. Even Christ only died once. So keep that in mind as we go about this. And his sacrifice is so perfect. His sacrifice is so great that it bears the sins and the sins of every person who has ever walked on the earth and will ever walk on the earth, was nailed to the cross with him. That's the magnitude that the Hebrew writer is trying to bring out. Now, something else that we see here. To those who eagerly wait for him, he will appear a second time. So now we get a little bit of a glimpse into the future. And let's break this down. Obviously, the easy one here, he will appear the second time, in reference to what? Reference to judgment. That's clearly what that is talking about, as a reference to judgment. He died once. He sits at the right hand of the throne of God. He's going to appear again. He's going to appear a second time. But now we break this down. Well, if he's going to appear the second time, let's look at the next part. Those who are eagerly awaiting for Christ to come back a second time. Reference to who? Christians. It's a reference to the church. The church is eagerly waiting. Should we not, as members of the Lord's church, be eagerly awaiting the Lord's return? I think we should. I think as members of the Lord's church, we should be eagerly awaiting the Lord's return. We actually see, it's over in the book of Colossians. The Colossians were actually, and they get rebuked for this because they were a little overzealous. You remember what the Colossians did when they were so eagerly awaiting the coming of the Lord? You remember what they did?
What the Thessalonians did.
What?
I'm not sure about the Colossians. I mean, what the people of Thessalonica did.
What the people of Thessalonica do?
They were so up for it, Paul had to write the second letter.
But the people in Colossians, they actually quit their jobs. They started selling all their possessions. Oh, the Lord's coming back soon. So they took soon as being, well, within just a few days. So they quit their jobs. They sold all of their possessions. And Paul had to rebuke them a little bit on that. No, just wait a minute. Just wait a minute. And the Thessalonians had some issues with the second coming of Christ too. But we should be eagerly awaiting, but we also have to understand that the second coming of Christ, we don't know when it's going to happen. I'm personally of the opinion, there are some that will argue this fact with me, but I'm personally of the opinion, you don't have to agree with me or disagree with me, take your view on this. I am personally of the opinion that not even Christ knows when he's going to come back. That the only person who knows when the world is going to end is Jehovah, God the Father. There are some that argue that, but it's either neither this nor that. But it's the idea, we as members of the church, we should eagerly await. In other words, it's the idea that, we still have to live our lives here on earth, but we should be prepared for the coming of Christ. We should be prepared for this. We should be prepared for that. We should be prepared for death. We should be prepared for judgment. And now, we've got Christians who are eagerly awaiting for the second coming of Christ, and he's going to come apart from sin for salvation. Here's the idea behind this. And again, this is just what I've come up with study. and I think it really fits here, especially in dealing with the second coming of Christ, is that him coming apart from sin is a reference to when Christ comes back the second time. Is he going to set foot on the earth? No. We're going to meet him in the air. So he's not going to even have a part of sin. Now, when judgment happens, the Christians, the church, those that are saved, are going to do what? We'll meet him in the air. He's going to be apart from sin. He's going to be completely separated from it. He's not going to set foot on this earth. Now again, there's a lot of denominations that teach when Christ comes back, what's he going to do? What? Yeah, he's going to set up an earthly kingdom. Some say, and there are different things. Some say, like James, he's going to set up an earthly kingdom in Jerusalem. He's going to sit on David's throne, and he's going to restore Israel to its former greatness. There are some who say, well, when he comes back, his headquarters, his throne, actually, they believe and teach that his throne is going to be in Independence, Missouri. You can actually go, and I'm not kidding, if you want to take a trip, you can go to Independence, and you can go to what is called the Temple Lot, and it is this square, it's fenced off, and you can see the place where the throne of Christ is going to be when he comes back in Independence. Now, it's not much there, it's just an empty lot with a fence around it. Last time I was there. But you can go see it in Independence. There are those that believe this. And that's what they mean. But the Bible very clearly teaches that he's going to be apart from sin. Now why? Because the first time he came, he dealt with the problem of sin, did he not? He died on the cross. He made the sacrifice. He dealt with the problem of sin. So the second time he comes, it's not to deal with the problem of sin, but it's to do what? To carry out this promise. To take the church home. That's the idea. He's going to bring us back with him, and we're going to finally have that eternal salvation. That's the second judgment. He's not coming back to take care of sin. He's already dealt with that problem. The second time he comes is to bring the church back, and we have that promise there that, Christ is going to come back, and when Christ comes back, going with him. As a matter of fact, it was such a big deal, and pick on Dennis here a little bit because he got ahead of me. It was such a big deal that, if you want to flip over there, 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. And look at verse number 18. This promise was such a big deal that Paul wrote, 1 Thessalonians 4, verse 18, comfort one another with these words. Well, what words are we to comfort each other with? Well, the words that he just got done talking about and dealing with, Christ is going to come back. He's going to come, he's going to appear in the air, the saints are going to meet him there, you're going to see it, and that's the idea. Comfort each other with those words. Now, this is a promise of God, a promise of Christ, that he came, he died once for our sins, he returned to heaven, he's coming back a second time, And when he comes back the second time, the saved, the church, the faithful, are going to go where with him? We're going to go back to heaven with him. We're going to meet him in the air. And this is only possible because Christ died once. It's only possible because Christ died once, and Christ made that sacrifice to forgive the sins of the whole world. All right. Are there any comments or questions on anything we've looked at thus far? All right. Let's move into chapter 10. We'll get a couple of verses in chapter 10. We're still going to be really building on this and really this is one of those places where I don't necessarily agree with the chapter break that's here. Verses 1 through 4 in chapter 10 really actually kind of fit the context better at the end of chapter 9. And we have to understand the chapters and verse breaks were inserted years later. After the scriptures were written. They were inserted years later by man, and they were put there merely as navigational tools, was the idea. So sometimes we kind of have to ignore the verse and chapter numbers and citations that we have in Scripture, because we've got to understand that. So chapter 10 and verse 1 kind of continues to build on this idea of Christ being this better sacrifice. Christ being the sacrifice that died once and for all. We're going to continue talking about some of the things we've already talked about. Verse number 1, for the law, having a shadow of the good things to come, and not the very image of the things, can never, with these same sacrifices which they offer continually, year by year, make those who approach perfect. So the Hebrew writer, he goes back and he brings something back to the forefront. Goes back to something he's already made mention of, something that we've already discussed, but the Hebrew writer brings it up again. The old law, he brings back to this forefront again. The old law, the law of Moses, was a shadow. It was a forerunner of good things to come. And I think it's interesting that the Hebrew writer puts that word good things to come. Now, was the law of Moses good? It was tough. What? Yeah, it was good. It was from God. It was good. It had its purpose. And I think the idea that we have to understand here is the idea of this could also be translated, could also be read, better things to come. Because isn't that what the law of Moses pointed to? Pointed to something better. That's the idea. We look at the shadows of better things to come. It wasn't the exact image of the church. It wasn't the exact image of the Christian law, but it was a shadow. And here it was a shadow of something that was coming that was better. And remember, that's the idea that we've been looking at throughout the entirety of the book of Hebrews. That basically the law of Christ and the church is better than the law of Moses. That's the idea of what we've been looking at. And I think that's how you can justify putting better in that verse. There. Because it was, the new law in the church is better. Then and he goes back and he brings out the sacrifices that were offered time and time again. I believe we actually sat down and we looked at the average amount of blood in some of the animals that we went on a website in school. Looked at the average amount of blood in these different animals, and then compared it to, we actually figured it out that the amount of blood that was shed in 1 year, 1 year, was enough to cover a football field up to, I believe we said 3 or 4 feet deep, was the amount of blood that was shed just by the children of Israel. And we took a number of 2.5 million people and the sacrifices of the blood, and we figured it out. And that's how much blood that was shed in 1 year. Now, think about that for a second. Because those sacrifices were offered continually, and we have this word here, never. Bring about what? Could never bring about perfection. You've got that much blood being sacrificed in 1 year, and it's over and over and over again, and it could not bring perfection. It could not bring forgiveness of sin. It could not do this. Verse number 2, for then would they not have ceased to be offered, for the worshipers, once purified, would have had no more consciousness of sin. But in those sacrifices there is a reminder of sins every year, for it is not possible that the blood of bulls and goats could take away sins. The Hebrew writer, he goes on and he brings out a very important point there in verses number 2. If the law of Moses had been perfect, if the law of Moses had been able to completely forgive sin, I think this is an important thought to bring out. Why did they have to continually offer sacrifices? Now, that's what the Hebrew writer is bringing out. You know, that if, going back to the end of verse 1, if the old law can forgive sins, if the law of Moses can clear your conscience of sin, if the law of Moses can make it to where you forget your past sins, why did they have to keep making sacrifices over and over again? And that's the question the Hebrew writer is asking. And that's the question I want to pose this morning. If the old law can make one perfect, why do you have to offer sacrifices over and over again? The answer is, you have to offer sacrifices over and over again because it can't. It does not have the power to forgive sins, and it ties in to verse number 4, that it is not possible, not possible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sin. Now, what's interesting, just let me see, is this, that phrase right there. The original King James, it says should take away sins. And this carries with it the idea of to take it away, or to destroy is the idea. To destroy sins, or to take it away. That's the idea that's being brought out. The blood of bulls and goats cannot do that. We had to have a perfect sacrifice. And I think it's interesting that the question is sometimes posed, well, if the blood of bulls and goats can't take away sin, why did God institute them as sacrifices under the law of Moses? You ever thought about that? Let me direct you to one verse. One verse. There are others, but let me point you in the way to one verse. Turn over to Galatians chapter 3. Galatians chapter 3, mark this in your Bibles. Galatians chapter 3, and look at verse number 24. Galatians chapter 3, verse number 24. Paul wrote to the church of Galatians, therefore, the law being what? It's the law of Moses. The law was our what? Our tutor, our schoolmaster, our teacher. To do what? To bring us to Christ. That was the purpose of the sacrifices of the old law. That was the purpose of the old law, to bring us to Christ. It paved the way to bring us to Christ. Those sacrifices under the old law was the shadow, going back to verse 1, the shadow of good things to come that paved the way for Christ. So there is something better coming. And these sacrifices are a way to kind of get your mind into things, to kind of get you thinking this way. Now we can go back and we can look. I believe it's in kick myself. I know it's in 1 Corinthians, but I cannot remember the chapter off the top of my head. Maybe 1 Corinthians 10. Where Paul tells the Corinthians, and Paul tells us that it's in 1 Corinthians 10. Verses 1 through 10, something like that. Paul tells the church of Corinth, and Paul tells us that the Old Testament, the old law, is there for our what? It's there for our learning. It's to be there as an example for us today. It's just a shadow of things to come.
Written for our admonition, verse 11.
What?
They were written for our admonition.
Yeah. Verse 11. These things happened to them as examples, and they were written for our admonition. In several verses there, and there it goes all the way down through verse 13. There's the end of that context. That deals with the idea of the law of Moses. It's this example. That's why it was put in place. It's this shadow of things to come, and bulls and goats, and something else to keep in mind that we think about was, you can go all the way back to the Garden of Eden. Genesis chapter 3. Go all the way back to Genesis chapter 3. Eve eats the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. She gives it to Adam. Adam eats of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. You remember what happens immediately after they eat that fruit. What do they realize about themselves? They realize they're naked. And what do they do? They make clothes out of leaves. Now, fast forward a couple of verses. God comes down and has a conversation with them and talks with Adam and Eve. What does God do? I think it's interesting. One of the first things God does because of Adam and Eve's sin is he does what? What?
He asks a question that he knows the answer to.
He asks a question that he knows the answer to. Yes, but what else?
Makes them better clothes.
Makes them better clothes. Animals. Man sins. What ultimately has to happen to take care of man's sin? Blood has to be spilled. And even going all the way back to the Garden of Eden, blood had to be spilled to take care of man's sin. Because there were animals killed so that God could make the clothing that Adam and Eve wore there. So going all the way back to there, blood had to be spilled. And here we're told, well, the blood of bulls and goats wasn't enough to take care of the sin. And next week, starting in verse 5, we'll talk about this. Therefore, when he came into the world, he said, sacrifice and offerings you did not desire, but a body you have prepared for me. And we're going to go on and we're going to start talking about this idea of, well, the blood of bulls and goats can't take away sin. Here's you a perfect sacrifice. Here's you a sacrifice that can take away sin. And that's what we're going to start looking at next week. Any other comments, questions, concerns? All right, we will take a short break. We're a couple of minutes early, but I don't want to go any further. So then we'll enter the worship here in a few minutes.